Whenever, Malin.
Okay, should we start?
Perfect.
Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Malin Arve from the Norwegian School of Economics, and I will be the moderator of this seminar today. And before we start, I just want to remind everyone that the seminar will be recorded and put online. But now to the more interesting part. So today's seminar is given by Elisabetta Iossa, and she will present the paper Organizing Competition for the Market, which is joint work with Patrick Ray and Michael Watterson. And Elisabetta will present her work for approximately 60 minutes, and she'll pause every 5 to 10 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions or comments, please send these via the chat function, and I'll relay that to Elisabetta. And then after her presentation, we'll have a discussion and a Q&A session. So we'll start by a discussion by Luis Cabral and Juanjo Ganuza. They will briefly discuss the paper, 3 to 5 minutes each, and Elisabetta will have time to respond very quickly. And then we'll open up for questions from the audience. And again, you can use the chat function to submit these questions, and then you'll have a choice between asking them in person, or if you want, I can read them out to Elisabetta as well. But I think that's enough for the organization. I'll just give the word to Elisabetta. You have about 60 minutes, and I'll interrupt you if you go over time or if you forget about the pausing for question part.
Okay. Thank you, Malin. Thank you, Natalia, and the organizing committee for this kind of invitation. So I'll present joint work, as Malin already said, with Patrick Ray from Toulouse School of Economics and Mike Watterson. This was an opportunity for us to revise the paper. So compared to the version that was circulated, we have some new insights, and I will point this out in the presentation. Some background. So the provision of public services, such as buses, rail, prison services, or waste collection, has been typically organized as in-house provision. And recently, we are observing instead a trend towards opening up of the market to competition in the form of competitive tendering. So this is a form of competition for the market, not in the market, in the sense that the contract that entitles a firm to provide the service is put up for tender. And the competition occurs among the firms submitting bids to win the contract and be entitled to service the market. This trend has even culminating, particularly in Europe, in legislation that makes competitive tendering compulsory by law. This is the case in Europe for railroad passengers. The issue, however, is not a new one. In London, competitive tendering has taken place since 1992 in the London bus market. Then the in-house operator was broken up into 12 different companies to prepare for the competition. These companies were later privatized. And there since, so it's now 30 years, we have observed the recurring tendering organized route by route. What does it mean, route by route? It means that a single route is a market, and the contract for the right to provide the service in the market is put up for tender. However, bundle bids are allowed, so firms can submit bids where they offer to provide the service in more than one market. Contracts last 5 years, and they are fixed price contracts since 2001. And the OECD in 2013 referred to this as a best practice, as persistent competition seems to be still observed. However, there is still hot debate, sometimes very hot. So in Rome, we witnessed buses burning for a number of reasons, but they were the reflection of a lot of discontent with the in-house operator performing poorly. To the point that in 2019, the citizens of Rome called a referendum asking to introduce competitive tendering, and 74% voted in favor. So the question is then still alive, and is how should we do it? Should we do like the British and break up the incumbent? And how should we start at date 0? Should we tender contracts synchronously, so all at the same time, so that tenders end all at the same time? Or should we organize tendering in such a way that contracts end in a staggered fashion, so tendering takes place in a staggered way? And what should be the duration of the contract that we should choose? Meantime, in Paris, at the OECD Global Competition Forum in December 2019, the move to competitive tendering was discussed. And among the various things, it emerged some concern of incumbency advantage that could be a factor to prevent competition from displaying its benefit. That came on top of other concerns that were expressed. In the UK, tender services apparently show increasing prices. That's a report by the National Audit Office. In France, bus tenders show just one bid in 60% of tenders. In Germany, where competitive tendering in the rail sector existed for many years, the in-house operator, Deutsche Bahn, is still a powerful dominant incumbent, owing a 67% of the market. And in a very beautiful paper, Christopher Wolf and Weyer-Graber found that this incumbency advantage fundamental, and it took the form of informational advantage. So what we do in this paper, we ask ourselves, how should we organize competition for the market? And in particular, market structure. At date 0, how should we choose market structure? We can do so by deciding whether to break up or not the incumbent. Because if we break up the incumbent, we are going to have an initial market condition that is more competitive than in the case where we don't break up. Should we do this? Is it worth it? Second question, how should we organize the tendering in such a way to decide whether we want contracts to end all at the same time, so that tendering time is synchronous, or should we organize it in such a way that tenders end at different times, so we have staggered tenders? And is there any link between these two questions? So should the tendering time that we choose depend on the market structure that we choose, and vice versa? And the final question, which is a new question that we ask, is what should be the contract duration that we select? Let me sketch the model, and then I will pause for questions. So the model we consider is one with two markets, Market A and Market B. We take the number of markets as exogenous, and for simplicity and tractability is only two markets, repeatedly put up for tender. But in date 0, a breakout decision has to be made. If the firm, the in-house incumbent, is broken up, it means that in state 0, you start with an incumbent in market A and an incumbent in market B. We call it state D. D stands for duopoly. Careful here, duopoly doesn't mean that there are two firms in the market. It means that there is one incumbent in one market and one incumbent in the other market. If instead you do not break up, then you're going to have the same incumbent in both markets. So we start from what you call state M. M stands for monopoly. Then we have recurrent tendering of two-period contracts. So in this scenario, we have three types of firms: the incumbent in market A, the incumbent in market B, who may be the same as the incumbent in market A, and an infinite number of entrants. And we have two possible states in each period. State M, monopoly, in which the same incumbent serves both markets, competing only against the entrants. And state D, duopoly, in which one incumbent in each market competes against each other and against the entrant. We assume, for simplicity, zero variable cost. So the key assumption in our model is that there is incumbency advantage. And in particular, this is, for example, what distinguishes it from Luis' paper, who focuses on economies of scale. For us, the issue is incumbency advantage, and we model it as stemming from sunk cost. So in all public services, firms to enter may have to incur some irreversible investment in key assets. And this is such that to serve a market, a firm must incur a sunk cost, and this sunk cost may be lower for active firms. This is the interpretation we give. In particular, thinking of our players, the incumbent has already sunk this cost. The neighboring incumbent, if there is one, must incur instead positive sunk cost, denoted by small s. This plays a major role in what follows. And the entrants, they must incur even a bigger sunk cost, denoted by capital S. In the revision, we are considering also other source of incumbency advantage. And in particular, we show that we could reinterpret SNS in such a way that the incumbency advantage stems from knowledge acquired through experience of market conditions, and from the fact that there is information decay, in the sense that market conditions change over time. This implies that recent knowledge is more useful than past knowledge. And then the incumbency advantage stems from the fact that the incumbent can observe more accurate signals. So I will not talk about this second interpretation. We will stick to the first one for this presentation. Last slide, and then I pause for questions. So I said that there are two-period contracts. Contracts can be put up for tender in a staggered way or in a synchronous way. Under staggered tenders, one market is up for tender in each period. In particular, each firm submits a price for the market up for tender, and the price is the only source of revenue. The lowest price wins, and the winner services the market at that price. Alternatively, tenders can be synchronous. In that case, both markets are up for tender every other period. Each firm then submits prices for each individual market, and given that they're synchronous, we also allow for bundle bids, so for a price for the bundle of the two markets. The best combination of bids wins, and the winner services the market at the bid prices. The equilibrium concept we use is Markov perfect equilibria. So we, in our setting, equilibrium strategies depend only on the current state, M or D. We don't consider collusive strategies. We do this in another paper with Leslie Marks and Simon Lercher. I know Leslie is here, so hi. Then we focus on coalition-proof Nash equilibria, which in our setting means is equivalent to Pareto-efficient Nash equilibria in each period, given the continuation value. And denote by delta the common discount factor. And I pause.
So there are a couple of questions. So the first one is from Larry White, and it takes us back to this motivating example of the London bus contract. So it's actually two questions. So Larry wants to know how service qualities were specified and enforced. And he's also asking about joint costs, for instance, repair and storage garages.
Joint cost, is it again?
So it says, how were service qualities specified and enforced? And then what about joint costs, such as repair garages?
Okay, so service quality is a very pertinent question because clearly it matters. It will not matter in our paper, but there is a specific reason for this. In the London bus example, quality is almost totally verifiable. with the new technology, GPS and so on, you can really observe the frequency of buses, you know, where they are in each point of time, if they're speeding up and so on. So quality matters, but we don't take quality into account in the model, just to simplify. In the London bus case, the way it works is that the firms bid the price and they agree to a certain level of quality. And if quality falls below a threshold, they get penalties. If it's above the threshold, they get bonuses. Okay, that's to talk about London. So joint costs, or in general, it could be an issue whether there are economies of scale or diseconomies of scale. Estelle Cantillon and Pessendorf found there were actually some diseconomies of scale. Some other times we wonder whether there were economies of scale. So we ignore these cost considerations. Let me just name now that Louis' paper shows that with economies of scale, you should go always towards monopolization. In our London bus case, we don't observe monopolization, but persistent competition. So we think that even for the case we study here, is not maybe the most relevant assumption. In any case, in the paper, we just, the per market cost is 0. There are neither economies nor diseconomies of scale. Okay, so maybe I continue.
Elisabetta, there's another question or a set of questions from David Talant. So the first is about, or the first set of questions is about the bids. So is the schedule part of the bid, or are there no schedule constraints? I think this refers a bit maybe to the bus question.
Scheduled, what do you mean scheduled, David? Scheduled bids?
I guess the bus schedule when the buses are running.
The bus schedule, okay. So the procurer sets what he wants in terms of frequency, okay? So then given this, they have to bid the price they want to provide that service according to the pre-specified frequency bus schedule. Okay, hi David. Okay.
And so still from David, do you consider multiple operators on a route?
No, 2 reasons. In buses in Norway, actually they had multiple operators on a route, and it was a disaster because they were running ahead one of the other in order to reach the bus stop. They had also some demand risk being transferred to the operator. So we don't, because we studied from the London bus example. And here is really a pure model of competition for the market. So as I said, the word duopoly doesn't mean there are 2 firms in one market, but there is always just one firm. Under duopoly, there is one incumbent in each of the 2 markets. Okay, let me maybe move on and then pause again. So what is the preview of the results? We find that in these dynamic games, there can be 2 outcomes: persistent monopoly, which means state M forever, one firm in both markets; persistent competition, state D forever. And which outcome arises depends on the market structure, breakup or not, and the tendering timing, staggered versus synchronous. In particular, we find that it's always optimal to break up the historical incumbent so as to start in the competitive industry structure, the duopoly, one incumbent in each market. And we find that whether you want synchronous tendering or staggered tendering actually depends on whether the parameters of the economy, the model, in terms in particular of discount factor delta and sunk cost S over S, are such that the outcome that will arise is persistent monopoly or persistent competition. And in particular, you want synchronous tendering when the fundamentals of the economy will be such that you can expect persistent monopoly. And this is because synchronous tenders are best to enhance the competitive pressure that comes from the entrants and induce the monopoly not to bid too high price. Instead, when the fundamentals are such that you can expect persistent competition to arise, you want staggered tendering because this is what is best to enhance competition that comes now from the other incumbent. I will give the intuition later. Furthermore, and this is a new result, the optimal contract duration, if you can choose one, is such that you can always ensure persistent competition. In practice, there may be many constraints why you can't just pick the contract duration with the purpose of ensuring persistent competition, but if you could, that is what we get. So these are the results. In the next slide, what I'm going to do is first, I'm going to show why we have these two possible outcomes under synchronous and staggered. Then I'm going to show what implication this has on market design and on tendering times. And finally, on optimal contract duration. So first thing is the equilibria. So we show that under both synchronous and staggered tenders, there are two types of equilibrium, a single state equilibrium and a dual state equilibrium. The single state equilibrium is one that leads to persistent monopolization. What does it mean? It means that wherever you are, if you are in state M, the monopolist wins against the entrant, and therefore in the next period you move again to monopoly. If you are in a duopoly state, one incumbent wins both markets, so you move again to monopoly. So monopoly arises as the equilibrium state. Alternatively, for other parameters of the model, there might be a dual state equilibrium. In the dual state equilibrium, what outcome you get depends on the initial state. And we will see this is very relevant for the breakup decision. In particular, if you're in state M, you will continue to remain in state M because the monopolist wins both markets against the entrant. If instead you are in state D, fortunately, will be good news, each incumbent now wins its own market. So it's not the case that one incumbent wins both markets. Each incumbent keeps its market, which ensures that there is persistent competition. In the revision of the paper, we also looked at whether these results are robust to relaxing the assumption of bundle bids. And let me just briefly mention this. And we find out if we do not allow bundle bids under synchronous standards, there are no new equilibria. In fact, some equilibria may be eliminated. In particular, you may eliminate the equilibrium where duopolies compete for bundle, but coalition-proof equilibria are unaffected. So the results are robust. And removing coalition-proof requirements allows the above equilibrium to survive, and this does not significantly change the result, meaning single state, dual state equilibrium arise for different parameter values, but it tilts the balance, as we see, a little bit in favor of synchronous standards. So let me show you, starting with staggered, how do we get this result? So consider a setting where tenders are staggered. So recall these are two-period contracts, and tender staggers, it means they're really, you know, if this is a two-period contract, the tenders are like this, okay? So when one contract is up for tender, the other contract is still running for one period. If I am in state M, it means that the monopolist is facing competition only from the entrants, okay? But to derive the continuation value, we need to define also what happens if there are two firms, one in each market. And to do so, I will use the term incumbent and the term challenger and use subscript I for incumbent, C for challenger, to refer to the firm that is the incumbent in the market up for tender, and respectively, challenger for the firm that is in the other market. Okay, so consider the payoff of the monopolist, staggered tender, state M. To find out how much the monopolist is willing to bid, so the lowest bid, consider what he makes if he wins and if he loses. Well, if he wins a price P, here. Then he obtains P. There are no sunk costs he has to incur because he's already there. And in the next period, he will obtain continuation value VM, M for monopoly, because he remains a monopolist. If he loses instead, well, he's losing the current market, but in the next period, there will be the tender in the other market where he is the incumbent, and therefore he's going to get VI. So the lowest bid for the monopolist is found by equating these two payoffs, and is given by this expression. What about the entrant? Well, the entrant, if he wins, a price P has to incur the sunk cost S, and is winning only one market. So in the next period, he has he acts as a challenger for the tender in the other market that will be up. The lowest bid for the entrant is therefore denoted by P, and is given by this expression equating the two payoffs. So it's immediate here that the monopolist always wins because the lowest bid is smaller, and it wins for two reasons. First, because if you compare the payoffs of the monopolist from winning and losing with the ones of the entrant, what you notice is that the monopolist has more to gain from winning, because by winning, he manages to keep monopoly profits, and this is results in a higher payoff, gain of payoffs, compared to the entrant, who instead, even if he wins, he can never monopolize. The best is that he becomes incumbent of this market, but he still has the competitor in the other market. Furthermore, there is a sunk cost advantage due to capital S for the monopolist. So both these reasons tell you the monopolist always wins. What about state D? Now competition is between the two incumbents, I in the market up for tender, C for challenger in the other market. We do the same kind of reasoning. We apply the same reasoning. So if the incumbent wins, what does he get? He gets a price P, and in the next period, he becomes the challenger because a contract is up for tender in the other market. If instead he loses, he's out of the market. And this is his best offer. The challenger, and he is a clear player in the paper, what does he get? Well, the challenger has an opportunity to monopolize the market. He's in the other market. If he wins the current tender, he becomes a monopolist. So if he wins, his continuation value is delta V, VM, discounted. However, to enter the current market, he has to incur sunk cost small s. And this gives the lowest bid for the challenger. Now, which one of the two is smaller, so he's going to win, is no longer obvious and depends on the parameters of the model. In particular, the challenger is going to win if this term, which we call the value of monopolization, is greater than the sunk cost of entry that the challenger has to bear. So it really shows that the challenger may win by being willing to incur higher cost S than the entrant today, because he has an opportunity to monopolize. And by developing the model, we find that this condition is equivalent to say that S over capital S must be small enough. This gives rise to a threshold, which we call sigma stag, such that if we are above this curve, so if S over S is less than sigma stag, then there is a single state equilibrium, in the sense that if we start from state D, we move to state M, because the challenger wins against the incumbent. If we are in state M, as we seen before, the monopolist wins against the entrant. So in both states lead to M, and we're going to have a persistent monopoly as outcome. This value of monopolization, which is shown in the formula, plays an important role and actually has a nice interpretation, because this value of monopolization, which is the value really of becoming a monopoly, is increasing in delta. Why is this? Well, because if you win today as a challenger, you monopolize and you will benefit from being a monopoly from the next tender onwards. So when delta is high, the future is closer, so it matters a lot, and therefore the incentive of the challenger to incur cost S to monopolize are stronger. Furthermore, you see here the condition S, small s over capital S. Why this capital S? Well, because the monopoly profits are increasing in the sunk cost of entry for an entrant. Once you are a monopolist, you know, the higher the cost for the entrants, the higher will be your profit. So when delta is high or capital S is high or small s is low, which is what we find in that condition, the equilibrium is a single state equilibrium with persistent monopoly. This is a key condition. When this key condition doesn't hold, so in the complementary case, instead we have a dual state equilibrium. Why dual state? Because now we can have two different outcomes: persistent competition or persistent monopoly. Persistent monopoly is like before, the monopolist keeps winning, but the new novelty is the persistent competition. So what is persistent competition? It happens when in state D now, the incumbent wins against the challenger because his best offer is lower. So it means that whenever you are in state D, you will continue to remain in state D forever. It's a dual state equilibrium. So you can already guess, and this will matter later for the market structure breakup decision, that which of the two outcomes arises will depend on the initial state, D or M. And clearly, because the condition is just the reverse of the one before, this holds when the monopolization value is smaller than the cost for the challenger of entering the other market. That is, when delta is low, capital S is low, so becoming a monopoly is not worth it, and small s is high. Okay, this is staggered. So we have identified this threshold sigma stag. It will be later shown in the graph. It's a nice increasing curve in delta. What about synchronous standards? So with synchronous standards, same logic. Remember, we're going to have again a single state equilibrium and a dual state equilibrium, similar features, different thresholds. So the logic is again that if the value of monopolization exceeds the cost for the incumbent in the other market to enter the market up for tender, or in case both markets are up for tender, like here at the same time, is the cost of servicing both markets, then the single state equilibrium will arise, in the sense that in state D, one incumbent will win both markets. So if you start in state D, you're going to move to M, because the two incumbents will compete in particular for the bundle. One incumbent will win, and given that here the two incumbents are in a perfect symmetrical situation, the competition among who is going to emerge as the monopolist is tough, and it leads to both incumbents obtaining a payoff of 0. In state M, as before, the monopolist wins, so again, we're going to have persistent monopoly when the value of monopolization exceeds small s. As before, however, we have the possibility of a dual state equilibrium. This occurs when the reverse of the previous condition arises, that is, when the value of monopolization is smaller than the sunk cost of entry for the firm in the other market. In which case, if you are in state M, you're going to continue in state M, persistent monopoly. If you are in state D, you will continue in state D, meaning one incumbent in each market with persistent competition. In this latter case, each incumbent wins its own market at the price that we derive as being less than the best offers by the entrants or the competitor, and it will be such that the duopolist prefers to win one market rather than two, and these are the equilibrium prices. So to recap, and then I pause, we have identified two boundaries, sigma stag and sigma sync. They happen to be different, and there will be a reason. For the time being, just notice that the boundaries divide the graph into two areas. Above the boundary, S over S is less than, is greater than the value of monopolization, and therefore you have a dual state equilibrium where both monopoly or duopoly may arise depending on the initial state. Below, instead, you have a single state equilibrium where monopoly arises, so persistent monopolization, whatever the initial state. We notice here, and I'll explain in a minute, that the boundary for the dual state equilibrium is stricter and therefore higher under staggered than it is for synchronous. And the next thing I'm going to show is that when we compare prices across all the scenarios, monopoly, duopoly, stag, and sync, there is a very nice relationship that will tell you that monopoly prices are lower with synchronous, duopoly prices are lower with staggered, and duopoly prices are lower than monopoly price. Questions?
So at the moment, there are two questions. The first one is from Natalia Fabra.
Hi, Natalia.
And she's asking about participation costs. So her concern is that in practice, that if potential bidders expect a persistent monopoly, then no entrant will in reality show up.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think you're right. If there are participation costs over and beyond what we capture with this entry sunk cost, okay, persistent competition may be more different to realize. So in a sense, though, the rule of the incumbency advantage model as sunk cost, takes that into account a little bit. No, so the entrants, the firms totally outside the market face higher costs than the ones who are inside the market, and the one that is really in the market up for tender faces lower cost of, you may say, of participating to the tender than the competitor.
And then the next question is from Dominic Bruckner. So he is asking if there's a possibility to handicap the incumbent with regard to the tendering, and thus compensating, for example, for the informational advantage of this incumbent. And he's asking if you have considered this.
Yes. Okay. So in practice, your question is super relevant in the sense that handicapping the incumbent is a strategy that's being considered, and there are some papers that look at the optimal design of the tender, where they consider also possibility of handicapping the incumbent. So we don't look at optimal tender design in that regard. So we don't allow the a real handicap. So in a sense, what will keep prices low for us is the competitive pressure. And I think I can also say that in our setting, this might be better than just handicapping, because if you handicap, for example, if you handicap the current incumbent in a duopoly, we will have to see what the effect of this will be on the total prices. It might be that the other firm wins, but this time with a bundle price, but this time, profits are not driven to zero. So we haven't looked at this because it's a different spirit that we are analyzing, but the question is pertinent.
Now Natalia is building on Dominic's question, and she's asking about reserving slots for entrants.
So what I suggest, reserving slot for entrants, let me pause this for later, because it is a relevant question. But when you reserve a slot for entrant artificially, you are weakening competition in some regards. No, you are because you're saying the incumbent cannot bid. In practice, so in a more general framework, it is a strategy that often works, especially to favor SMEs. Okay, so, but let me pause it for later, because again, it will not make sense in our, I mean, in our setup, everything is known. So if you have to choose the optimal strategy, just take price equal to 0, no? So the spirit of this exercise is a different one, more than sort of a design of the optimal tender with a mechanism. Okay, so, but I'll maybe come back for more of this later. Okay, so let me now give an explanation as to why we find that relationship on prices and duopoly. I mean, the nice thing I would say in this paper is that really, when we started, we had no idea what we will observe. And the mathematics led us to results that sometimes we found you know, so clean that surprised us, and only later we understood the intuition. So in a sense, it's good. So what did we find? First result, monopoly prices are lower under synchronous tender. Clean. Why is this? Well, think about a setting where there is a monopoly and M survives, so persistent monopoly. So then the monopoly's price are kept low by the competitive pressure that comes from the entrant only. And to keep these prices low, synchronous is better simply because with synchronous contracts, an entrant by bidding can monopolize. And we have shown that, you know, the juice is really in the monopoly profits. And the staggered tenders, instead, a firm that enters today still has to wait one period to become a monopolist. So the reward for monopolization arrives later. And this is why competitive pressure by the entrant is maximized with synchronous tenders if the state is a monopoly. And let me say that this is a result that is, I would say, complement Luis Cabral paper on staggered tenders with economies of scale, where he finds that with economies of scale, staggered tenders increase monopoly power. It's a different explanation, but the outcome is the same. If we are expecting persistent monopoly, we want to use synchronous tenders. However, the next slide says, and we have seen from the discussion on the equilibria, that sometimes we can expect duopoly, persistent competition, to arise. In that case, actually, we prefer staggered tenders, the other way around. And why is this? Well, it stems actually from the previous point, because when you are in a duopoly, what is keeping the incumbent price low is the competition that comes from the other incumbent. And staggered tenders increase the competitive pressure that comes from the other incumbent vis-a-vis synchronous tenders. Why is this? It follows from one. Because the monopoly profits are greater under staggered tenders, did I say correctly? Yes, because the challenger's gain from monopolization is greater from under staggered tenders, the pressure the challenger exerts will be greater under staggered tenders. So it will induce the incumbent to bid really low in order not to lose the market. Third, duopoly prices are lower than monopoly price. This is reassuring. And why is this? Well, actually, in our setting, this comes from point 1 and 2 together. And the fact that if you're in a monopoly, what is keeping the monopoly's price low is the pressure, the competitive pressure comes from the entrants. But the entrants have to incur capital S. What is keeping price low under duopoly is the pressure that comes from the other incumbent. But the other incumbent to enter only has to incur small s. So given that small s is less than capital S, you can imagine that the other incumbent, so the challenger, exerts more competitive pressure under a duopoly than an entrant does under monopoly. And finally, remember the graph where I showed the threshold, the sigma stag and sigma sync, and I said that one is above the other. Why is this? Well, One is above the other. In particular, sigma stag is above sigma sync. The red line is above the blue line, which means that synchronous standards make persistent competition more likely. The range is wider. And this is because point 1, 2, and 3 tell us that the monopoly prices are lower, but the duopoly prices are higher under synchronous standards. So synchronous standards reduce the value of monopolization, which implies that you're going to have a dual state equilibrium with persistent competition more often. Okay, I can pause a minute or in 2 minutes. If there is a question, I take it.
There are no questions right now.
Okay.
No.
Okay. So we have shown that staggered tenders yield lower duopoly prices. Synchronous tender yield lower monopoly prices. Okay, so this is telling us already intuitively that if you're expecting persistent duopoly, you want to pick up staggered tenders. If you're expecting persistent monopoly, you want to pick up synchronous tenders. And in fact, we could have ended the discussion of the market liberalization here. However, we realized that the first period actually matters a lot, in the sense that for two reasons. First, because when you think of the dual state equilibrium, deciding whether to break up the incumbent or not actually plays a massive role, because it determines the initial state. In particular, if you break up, the first tender is in state D. If you do not break up, the first tender is in state M. But in the dual state equilibrium, the initial state remains forever. So breaking up allows you to pick up the persistent competition outcome rather than the persistent monopoly outcome. And this suggests that it's always optimal to break up the historical operator to start from a dual state rather than a monopoly state. However, there is a little bit of further result to be careful about, because if you recall, there are some regions where the persistent competition does not arise. And these are, for example, the ones below here, where there is persistent monopoly under both synchronous and staggered. Okay, this means that even if you start in a duopoly, from the next period you want to move to monopoly. So is it worth it to break up the incumbent? Well, the answer is yes. And why is this? Because by starting from a duopoly, you induce the two firms to fight to become a monopolist in the next period. So you're going to have really low first period prices. It's the bidding to become monopolist from the next period. And this again is positive in terms of lower prices. So it explains that even when you know that persistent monopoly will arise from the next period onwards, you want to start from a duopoly. There is also an additional effect that we emphasize, and that is the fact that actually when you consider this first period competition, now there is one additional reason in favor of staggered tenders, and that is related to the fact that, recall, staggered tenders result in higher monopoly prices, which means that the value of monopolization will be greater, which means that the firms bidding in period one will bid extremely aggressively under staggered tender. And this can tilt the balance further for staggered tenders. So when we take this first period into consideration, the optimal decision remains to break up the incumbent, but whether you choose staggered or synchronous tender is defined by this red and green line. And you may choose staggered tenders even if you are below the red line. That is, even if you know that from tomorrow onwards, there will be persistent monopoly. Let me say that the way we derived this insight in the paper was by building a story with two cities. So now there are two cities where two markets had opened up for competition in each period. Period 1 and period 2. And the decision of the procurer is whether to open up two markets in one city today and two markets in one city tomorrow, so as to have synchronous tender in each city, or to open up one market today in one city and one market today in the other city, so that in each city you have staggered. We did this exercise with two cities, a little bit maybe out of the blue, but the purpose was to avoid to have other effects in the comparison. Because the problem is that when you choose staggered, you're saying, today you start a tender, and then the next tender you have to start it one period later in order to have staggered tendering. Okay, so this city exercise avoid us to change anything else in the model and just focus on staggered versus synchronous. We do have in the revision another exercise where we check whether there is a results continue to hold. If in case you choose staggered tenders, what you do is you start all tenders today, but in one market, the first tender is for 2 periods, and then again, 2 periods, 2 periods, 2 periods. In the other market, so as to have staggering, you have the first tender just for 1 period, and then 2 periods, 2 periods, 2 periods, so as you stagger them. And the results are really unaffected. Okay, questions?
So there's a question from Larry White again, and so he's asking whether the gain from breaking up the historical incumbent comes from the fact that the new incumbent in the second market incurs only small s and not big S in its bidding for the first market.
Okay, so we assume that when you break up in date 0, none of the two incumbents faces any cost for servicing their market. But as Larry correctly said, like in any future period, they will have to incur small s for servicing the other market. But the gain from starting for a duopoly for us does not stem from so much sunk cost consideration. It stems from the fact, let me go back, that we have identified this equilibria. Okay, single state, dual state, okay? In a single state, even if you break up, you move in the next period to monopoly. But in a dual state, if you did not have an initial state as D, you will never reach persistent competition. So if you make it wrong at the beginning, you will never get back to competition. And this is why it's important to break up. It's the way to ensure at period 0, in a setting with incumbency advantage, this seems reasonable, that more than one firm is able to compete, and therefore competition will remain. Okay, if there are no more questions, let me spend the last
questions. So you have 7 minutes left.
Super. One further extension that we've done, and again, this has been a surprise, the beauty of mathematics, is to consider the optimal contract duration. We consider here 2-period contracts. That's how we started. But imagine, and we follow Cabral here, that we define the underlying model in a continuous time with period length delta. So then capital delta. That small delta captures the contract length. Higher delta means shorter contracts. Then imagine that you can choose delta under both staggered and synchronous contract. What do you choose? Well, basically what we realize is that for any S over S, you're going to put yourself precisely in the level of delta that gets you on the boundary. If you are staggered, it will be the boundary sigma stag. If you are in sync, it will be the boundary sigma sync. And why is this? Well, because if you start from duopoly and you place yourself on the boundary just a little bit to the left, you will continue to be in a duopoly, which is the preserved competition case. And this is great. But on top of it, because you are on the boundary, you are just where the equilibrium from a persistent duopoly switches to monopoly forever. And if you recall, in that equilibrium, duopolists get a 0 continuation value. So given continuation values are continuous, picking the contract duration precisely on the boundaries allows you to achieve two things: preserve competition, and given that you start from D and competition is preserved, no one sinks any cost, so efficiency is preserved. And on top of this, you have 0 prices. So if you can pick the optimal contract duration, then tendering regime don't matter. You get preserved competition with minimal prices. We also find the result that the optimal contract duration, however, is greater for staggered tenders than for synchronous, because when you fix S over S, you cross first the boundary sigma stagger and then sigma sync. And this is to reflect the fact that with staggered, you want contracts to be slightly longer so as to avoid that the value of monopolization is too large and the firm may monopolize. So let me spend the last few minutes on the work Mike has done on the Transport for London. Has been very interesting. We thank Estelle Cantillon for giving us the data initially, and then we'll continue to collect them. So there are lots of papers, Cantillon, Pesendorfer, Ameral Saucier, they already talk about Transport for London because it's a best practice case. So what is super nice is that what we find is that really 30 years after, there is still competition. There are still 10 companies active. It's a mix of synchronous and staggered tenders. We can't say, which one is the dominant tendering format, but there is an incumbency advantage up to 75% of the time. The incumbent wins. Sometimes it has changed the name, but it's still the incumbent. We also find that incumbent win more often with bundle bids. We're not sure why. This is something we're investigating. What is nice is that where does the incumbency advantage comes from? It comes first from garage proximity. So this picture, Mike built on Google Maps, looking at the location of the garages, and the different colors represent different firms. So garage ownership is dispersed, and this explains to us persistent competition, but garage proximity is still key ingredient for determining who wins. In fact, we find that in 47% of the time is the firm with the garage closest to the route that wins. However, if you look at this table here, what we find is that there are at least 3 firms. Can you see this less than 15 minutes? At least 3 firms, almost half of the time, they have a garage within 15 minutes from the route. And when we do some simulation to see what it means in terms of cost, having a garage 2 or 3 minutes further away, that basically what we find is that actually 15 minutes is perfectly fine time, and there is no huge cost difference between 5 or 15. So this says that for every route, there are at least 3 firms able to compete, and it's surprising, but the average number of bids per tender is 3. So garage proximity explains incumbency advantage, although it doesn't tell us who of these 3 firms will be selected. And we think that now, but it's a conjecture, that there is some other factor that it might explain incumbency advantage, and this is linked to information on PVR. PVR is peak vehicle requirements. So Transport for London, this is the last phrase, Transport for London tells you the frequency with which buses need to stop at each stop, but it doesn't tell you how many buses you need. So this is the information decay interpretation. No? So in the sense that being incumbent allows you to to have better knowledge of how many buses you need to satisfy the quality requirements in the contract. If you pick too many buses, you're wasting money. If you pick too few buses, you will incur penalties. So this seems to be another source of incumbency advantage. As a related literature, just 1 minute, I mentioned already the paper by Luis Cabral. There are also papers, and I mentioned the paper with Leslie, Simon Lercher, and Patrick on collusion, staggered versus synchronous. There are lots of other papers on how to design the tender to maintain competition in recurring procurement. It's a very interesting topic. There, the approach is more on optimal tender design. So mechanism design helps a lot. And things like handicapping or set aside are considered. Our setting, as I said, does not look into that. So to conclude, we find that market structure and tendering time are inherently interlinked. It's optimal to break up the historical provider, net of transaction costs. Staggered tenders enhance entry and competition across markets. Synchronous tendering enhances competition for the market. Discount factor, which means contract length and relative sunk cost, play a key role. But if you can pick up the contract duration optimally, you can really manage to preserve competition. We are currently working on entry. So if you think about in our setup, entry never happens. The entrants are less, have to incur sunk costs and are never more efficient. So now we're working, but we haven't managed to complete on the case where there could be a shock so that a firm really enters. And then from monopoly, you may end up to duopoly. Okay, and I stop here.
Thank you very much, Elisabetta. Thank you for an interesting talk and for being perfectly on time. So now we move on to the second part of the seminar. So before opening for general questions from the audience, we'll have discussions by Luis Cabral and Juanjo Ganuza. But we'll start with Luis. You want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Malin. So thanks for giving me the opportunity. I thought that instead of going through detailed technical comments, I would probably focus a little more on the big picture type of remarks. In fact, starting from a very, very global introduction, macroeconomics people frequently make fun of people in IO because, you guys spend years and years studying an industry like yogurt, which is less than 1% of GDP, whereas we have a model of the economy. We're the guys who really know about GDP. But that's not fair, really, because our motto in IO is all industries are not the same. I mean, that's one of the wonderful things about IO is the richness of the variety of institutional and other details in competition. And so we need to study essentially one industry at a time because that's the nature of things. Moreover, once you start adding all of the industries that share a certain number of features, as is the case with the paper today, well, it does add to a significant share of GDP. There's a lot of examples that feature the characteristics that we saw in the paper today. So that's sort of by means of general introduction. I think this is a good example of how details matter. So staggered contracts. I thought I'd just talk a little bit about my own experience because I think it's helpful to understand why details matter. So in 2012, I went back and looked at my email. I was approached by the Portuguese Football League. They needed help because of contracts. These are the television contracts that teams write with a television, with cable. And well, this being football, a matter of national interest, I accepted the challenge. And so what I found is that in Portugal and Spain and a few other European countries, the television rights are still negotiated at a team level. And what was happening was that there was one buyer who was buying all of the teams, and they had long-term contracts, about 8 years, and they were staggered. And you can see, it's not rocket science. You can see how staggered contracts in this context were really bad because it was very difficult for a different cable operator to start acquiring the rights from teams, because what good is it for me to have the rights to only one team for a number of years? So this is really the key term in here is scale economies, network effects. What's the point of having only one team? I'm saying that so as to, for us to understand what are the important features of different industries. Anyway, so that's what I looked at. So I went and looked at the literature. And so what do you do when you're doing applied theory in IO? You go to the Bible, and then the Bible says, yeah, there's some sort of idea that staggeredness may lead to more market power. It would be nice if somebody wrote a model. By the Bible, I mean Tyrol, of course. So,
yeah. I thought it was.
Yeah, I said, well, let's write that model, and so I did. And intuition, I think, and Elisabetta also already mentioned that in some ways, it really goes back to Gilbert Newbery, probably one of the most important papers in the history of IO, in my opinion. And that's the whole idea of non-convexity. So if you have 50% of the market, you have a lot more to gain from getting the other 50% of the market than for a firm that has 0% of the market. So that was sort of the idea. And then when I was presented that years ago, Kai-Ove Kuhn, who was then the chief of GDCOM, he said, well, not so fast. He was, really didn't like the paper, I think, because DGCOM had just made a series of decisions in favor of staggered contracts. And so he said, well, you're really not capturing everything in here. And there may be things like capital requirement, things that you're not capturing. And I said, well, thanks for your comments. But of course, as often we do, I put a paragraph in the paper, but I kind of ignored that. And kind of in the back of my mind, I knew that, yeah, there may be industries where this really doesn't apply. What the idea that I mentioned earlier. And then I came across this paper a few years ago. And I think it's really neat because what it says, as Elisabetta very eloquently put it, is that, well, sometimes there's other things that matter in addition to network effects and scale economies, in particular incumbency advantages, which is something that I was not particularly interested because at least in the examples that I was looking at, other ones were like Nielsen and things that have to do with a lot with media, in the media space. Really, incumbency advantages of the sort we're considering here were not very important. But then you start realizing, gee, if they're important, then things change quite dramatically. And I think it's a very clever and clean idea and intuition. Interestingly enough, it actually goes back to Gilbert Newbery again, even though in a different way. It's funny how this idea of non-convexity and monopoly and duopoly profits can actually have different applications. And here we have an interesting example of how the rules of the game, the extensive form of the game, and the underlying payoff functions matter a lot as to how the Gilbert Newbery intuition applies. So I saw this paper from its earlier stages and I liked it a lot then. I still like it a lot. And I look forward to reading the missing sections in the current draft, in particular the ones on endogenous contract duration. One thing that the authors were very careful, and just as a remark in here, is that they're actually looking at, they're comparing different games. So synchronous and staggered contracts are different games. They're not different equilibria of a game. The reason why I'm saying that is that I've been suffering a lot at the hands of editors and referees on that, in the sense that, well, you're just comparing the equilibria of two different games. Well, yeah. Anyway, so I spent a lot of time looking at the situation, the idea of a contract structure as arising endogenously from a game where the relevant players can determine not only contract length, but also about what contracts, whether they're staggered or asynchronous. And I would be curious as to what would happen in this case, even though the more I think about it, the less I think that this is as relevant as it is in my case. Because in here, the buyer basically has that power. Exactly. And so it's more of a decision problem more than an equilibrium problem. Nevertheless, I think it's an interesting theory question, the idea of endogenous contracts. Maybe there are some examples of incumbency advantages where sellers have some power to decide on a contract structure, in which case this would be, I believe, an interesting question. Let me just tell you, it's probably a different paper because it is messy once you start looking at, because even the strategy space just becomes just enormous. You have to do something about it. I can tell you that from my own experience, at least. So in conclusion, because it's supposed to be only 3 to 5 minutes, true story. So I had an undergraduate student the other day said, hey, you taught us 2 models, the Bertrand and Cournot. Why did you teach us 2 models? Why not just to teach us the best of the 2 models? And then I realized, gee, I'm really not doing a good job at teaching IO. So I'm going to have to go back and insist on this idea. All industries are not equal. Details, including technological and institutional details, matter a lot. In fact, what you mentioned about the London bus example, I think it's really neat to try to understand what's the, where do these incumbency advantages come from? And I think this is one of the things that makes IO kind of cool, much cooler than macro, that, we actually have to look at very detailed institutional, technological, and so forth details. So in this case, my summary, if network effects or scale economies are relatively more important, it's likely that synchronous contracts are worse, increase market power. Synchronous contracts are better. Yeah. Whereas if incumbency advantages are relatively important, it's likely that even though with a lot of qualifications, that staggered contracts may perform better. The other thing that I also find interesting in this paper, and I keep repeating that, a lot of the applications we have in IO, static models are fine, but there are problems when you really need dynamics. Dynamics really matter. They're not superfluous in here. They actually are very much an integral part of the results, which I think is kind of nice. So to conclude, the model multiplicity curse is not a curse. In fact, it's something that's something great about IO. And well, long live IO. Back to you, Melanie.
Thank you very much, Luis. I think we should move directly to Juanjo,
okay.
And then Elisabetta, maybe you can just comment at the end, if that's okay. Juanjo?
Okay, but I am going to start also with the joke that macro make to IO. That thing about us, like we like a lot the toys, but I think, however, one thing, and it is true, I completely agree with Luis. So I think that the details of the industry matters a lot to understand the business model. And now that we have in a complete revolution, a change of technology, we really realize that. But there is the only thing I don't like of the paper of Elisabetta is that they have one sentence that I see like 100 times in the procurement papers, explaining the importance of procurements in terms of the GDP in the OECD countries. We don't have to apologize. I think that everybody knows that is so important, not only in terms of GDP, but also, and this is my answer to the macro guys, is like the only thing that matters is the gains in productivity, and the gains of productivity gains, for example, for liberalization and for introducing competition in sectors we don't have that. And then there are very few papers, and this is that basically talk about how to organize this public tendering. And for this reason, I like very much this paper because I think it's an important contribution to the literature. No? And also I think that it's very natural to consider that for instance, asymmetric and the incumbents have an advantage. I think that I can review very fast, the results. I think I like very much to have another arguments to convince regulators that they have to split natural monopolies and basically to start with a more fair distribution of the market power among the incumbents. This will be just an important thing. And also, I agree also with Luis that the paper is very neat. So it's very clean. So I think it's very easy to just to highlight the two main results, and we expect monopolization. In that case, synchronous tendering is superior because basically competition came from outside entrants, and when duopoly may be the outcome of the natural market, the staggered contracts can be superior. In terms of questions, I think that the paper, I think is almost ready. Yeah, I think it's very advanced in the publication process, but I am talking more about the line of research. The first thing about modeling choices, for the question that you address in this paper, I think that the model is perfect in the sense it's focusing on inflated horizon with Markov equilibria. However, it is true that we were deciding between staggering contract and synchronous contract. I think collusion matters a lot, and especially when you can have a multi-market content. But I know that you have another paper that I saw that basically tackled this. And also when we are talking about a period of concession of 5 or even more years, I think that even you can convey the message in 3 periods, for example, in a more modest kind of model, and you allow this allow you maybe to introduce, for example, cost heterogeneity and uncertainty. That would be nice for other papers. My main critique of the paper, and I think it's partially solved by the revision was that you take like a fundamentals of the market, the incumbent advantage, and also the discount factor. And then I think you have already tackled this. I think this was my comment when I read last week the paper, is that we know that basically the discount factor is very related to the period of the concession. Entonces, then, and I think it's nice, I didn't see in detail the extension you have done with continuous time, but even with the, you just, with the intuition that you said that the shorter concession just increase the discount factor, I think it's enough just to keep more of the conclusion. So in some part, this is endogenous and it's not basically a fundamental. And also, it is true that the advantage of the incumbent, this X, is also endogenous. It's only endogenous when you are designing how to liberalize the process. So basically, you can just split this asset, but you can also regulate how they have to be transferred, this asset. And also because you think about buses in Spain, for example, how the liberalization process has been taken into account, usually the concessions has been taking place using score auctions. And the incumbent advantage is very related to how the score is designed. No? In this particular setting, it is true that you just discount, for example, this competitive advantage, but just, you can just make a very fair play field. And if you are interested only in prices, this is going to eliminate most of the friction. So it is true that with the auction design, you can affect basically this X. In some way, it's not a fundamental. But my other critique is when you think, the problem is, for what you are analyzing, you are very close to the application for the London buses, the perfect model, and the paper is just perfect. If you want to be more ambitious and just go further and just to try to imply this insight to other market, I think that when you have the section, this market design, and basically you decide what is the best regime, you have to take into account also total surplus and efficiency in this. That basically the idea is the incumbent advantage is just is sunk cost, and someone has to replicate. When we are designing basically the structure of the market, we have to take into account this sunk cost. And especially when you are, for example, designing a single concession, we are talking about always about, when I explain this to my, in the master courses, I explain about the cafeteria of the university, you always deal with efficiency issues. So basically, some advantages of the incumbent are related to cost advantage that we want to preserve in some way. And also, when you just give the concession to the incumbent, you have to take into account you have a holdup problem, and there will be an investment, and you have to keep in some way this capital for the next time. So these are important matters, not for the current application, and it's just perfect, but I don't know, for this line of research in general. And also, it's very nice just to go deeper about the incumbent advantage, no? Because I don't know, like I told you, sometimes endogenous to the design of the procurement process, but other time there could be also disadvantage. You can oblige, for example, to potential interest to acquire the inputs of the previous incumbent. So I think sometimes they have disadvantage because they cannot just to take a technology. And I think that they are looking for the potential taxonomy of these advantages and disadvantages of the incumbent. These are, I don't know, this is a fruitful line of research for making many papers and many questions. And I think that's all.
Thank you. Malin, can I give a quick answer, and then maybe Patrick wants to add something?
Sure.
Okay, so let me say, I really thank both Luis and Juanjo for talking about the big issue, because I think we should always step back and look at that. We all agree that these are big issues. Juan, you mentioned that we should stop justifying why procurement is so important. We just, unfortunately, we still have, in some journals, have to remind editors that procurement is a big issue. But I agree with you. In terms of, for Luis, in terms of the comment on Gilbert and Newbery, absolutely. And the beauty of the mathematics in our case was we realized it's exposed. So only after solving on the model, we realized that everything was about the value of monopolization vis-a-vis the cost. So it's, and that explains so much. The one thing about, I agree that the beauty of IO is also having, you know, maybe different recommendations for different setups. And of course, I did ask myself, okay, if in Rome they call me and they say, how should we organize this market? What am I going to say? Maybe they say we cannot break up the incumbent because they don't want to. You know, there are political oppositions. It's always very, very difficult. And also, you know, it might be very difficult to find out whether it is economies of scale that is the most relevant assumption or incumbency advantage. Trying to move from theory to policy, I think I would say that on top of this is that sometimes possibly having the different scenarios also help you guiding policy on, as Juan was suggesting, how not to get to the scenario. What I mean is, it's true the S over S to some extent are a choice variable to some extent. So the way the British organized London bus tendering by at day zero having all the garages scattered around London and dispersed ownership is clearly something that has helped a lot. They still have incumbency advantage because we see that the incumbents win all the time or the challenger, but there are no new entry. But I'm sure if they hadn't done that, we would have seen monopolization. so in a sense, you know, I think also this is helpful, and I also I'm thankful that you know Luis noted that the dynamic model was here needed, persistent competition. One other thing, very briefly, on total surplus versus efficiency. So in the end, when we do contract duration, we have you know, full efficiency because some costs are not incurred and the prices are kept to zero. We had the discussion with Patrick at some stage because you know, the other problem is that you see sometimes when you look, for example, a total discounted price, you may have that one configuration gives you a very low price in the initial period because everybody's competing to become the monopolist, and then prices are very high later on. And as economists, we will just keep that issue aside and say, well, we need to redistribute surplus from today's generation to tomorrow. But obviously, in practice, it doesn't happen. So you know, it's been interesting to discuss this issue, and also, you know, taking into account that sometimes it really matters whether prices are low in period one or later on because of all the further constraints. So thank you. I will,
thank you very much, Elisabetta, for this. So Larry White has now joined us, and he has another question, comment. So I'll let him give you that himself.
Okay, well, great, thank you. And I found the paper interesting, made me think a lot. My head started hurting, which is generally a good thing. I'm coming to the paper new, and I may be too late, or Luis, you will love the metaphor. Perhaps all the buses have already left the barn, okay? But your continued, I know this is a paper about competition for the market, or if you like, the market for the market. Right? But the constant reference to monopolist and duopolist kept on confusing me. And, you know, I kept on having to think what you're really talking about is whether there's a single incumbent who's bidding for the market, or there are dual incumbents who are bidding for the market. And of course, you've got all those entrants out there at the fringe. And, you know, if you could start, again, it may be too late, but if you could start over, I would suggest just sticking with single incumbent and dual incumbents as a better, you know, maybe nobody else had that kind of sort of conceptual temporary confusion and then having to come back, and then temporary confusion and then coming back. The other thing I want to echo, Luis, the Gilbert Newberry paper, I think, is one of the underappreciated classics. It just is so important for thinking about a lot of these incumbent versus challenger type type problems. Terrifically important.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Larry. I think actually, I did say precisely because I know that the word duopoly may be confusing. So I said careful here that duopoly means two firms, but the fact that one incumbent in each market, but you might be right, and we will discuss this, using a different terminology so as to avoid this confusion may be better, because it's definitely not just you. We had this comment before.
You know, I mean, just
single and dual.
I think that, you know, you're really talking about the, you know,
it's still a monopoly.
In the second markets, they're both monopolists.
Yes, absolutely.
And so I constantly was having to sort of, what are they talking about? And then come back, and then I'd lose it again. And so I think better, you know, words shape how we think. And
single and dual. Thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's one instance in which it may be better to have two monopolies than a single one, you know, as opposed to what we are teaching about double evangelization and so on.
That's a good comment, Patrick. Are there any other questions from the audience? Then please feel free to ask them, write them in the chat. So I'll talk a little bit maybe. So everyone has mentioned the beauty of I/O, and for my sake, I would like to mention the beauty of Elisabetta's presentations and papers, because they are so clear that there are not any questions. I think that's a compliment to you, Elisabetta.
Well, we had the questions, but thank you. Thank you.
We had some questions.
Yeah, I'm glad if it was clear.
Well, at the moment, there are no more questions. Does anyone on the panel have?
Maybe Patrick, you want to say something?
Natalia wants to say that it's a great seminar.
No, it was a great presentation.
Very nice.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good. So then maybe we can conclude
I
here
agree.
And say thank you to everyone for attending and asking questions, and to Elisabetta, of course, and Patrick and Michael.
And Juanjo and Luis for reading the paper carefully. Definitely. And being available, which is you know, always super nice, and for the very relevant, interesting, and friendly comments.
And congratulations for the very nice paper.
Thank you. Thank you.
thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Bye bye. Bye bye.